from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, Trump's new world order is here.
The United States arrested a narco-trafficker who is now going to stand trial in the United States in accordance with the rule of law for the crimes he's committed against our people for 15 years.
The fast-paced developing news tonight, Maduro charged declaring his innocence. Delcy Rodriguez sworn in as Venezuela's acting president, and stocks moved higher, oil prices rising along with gold.
We'll have a live report from New York shortly after Nicolas Maduro appeared in his first court appearance, and we'll hear congressional reaction to the Trump administration's moves in Venezuela when Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York and Democratic Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander of New Hampshire join us.
Plus, Romaine Bostick will also be here to dive into the market reaction as American oil companies prepare for that new world order. And of course, our political panel joins us to discuss where all of this goes from here.
But we begin this evening in New York, where Nicolas Maduro, the ousted Venezuelan president, arrived by helicopter this morning to face charges that could keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. Bloomberg's Myles Miller joins us now with the latest. Myles, a not guilty plea from the former president.
That's right. As you said, ousted Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro pleading not guilty to those narco-terrorism charges here in Lower Manhattan. And as you said, these charges could put him behind bars for the rest of his life. When he walked into the courtroom today, he wished people Happy New Year. But at one point, someone in the gallery screamed at him, and he had a loud outburst saying that he had been kidnapped. And he said that he was still the president of Venezuela. Little did he know that at that same time he'd walked into the courtroom, he had been replaced by his vice president. He and his wife sat wearing headphones for translation as Judge Alvin Hallerstein read the charges against him. And when asked to enter a plea, he said through an interpreter, "I am innocent, I am not guilty, I am a decent man, I am the president of my country." 4 counts leveled against him: narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and weapons charges. His wife also hit with 3 counts. If convicted, again, looking at life in prison. Here's what prosecutors say happened. They say Maduro turned Venezuela into a cocaine highway. Starting in 2000, they say he moved loads under the protection of Venezuelan law enforcement. He becomes the foreign minister in 2006, and that is when they say he started selling diplomatic passports to traffickers when they needed to move drug money back from Mexico. He arranged for government planes to fly under the diplomatic cover, meaning that no one was checking what was on board. The indictment says he and his wife ran armed escorts to protect cocaine shipments. They maintained state-sponsored gangs to facilitate the operation. And then when people didn't pay or threatened their business, they allegedly ordered kidnappings, beatings, and worse, murders. And the scale is massive. By 2020, the State Department estimated 200 to 250 tons of cocaine per year were moving through Venezuela. Also charged their son, the interior minister, and a gang leader. Maduro is represented by Barry Pollock, the same lawyer who represented Julian Assange, who said Maduro needs medical treatment and that his wife also needs medical treatment for injuries sustained during their capture. The judge ordering him held without bail. He'll be back in court March 17th. The trial won't happen until 2027.
All right, Bloomberg's Myles Miller reporting all day for us in front of the courthouse in New York. Thank you so much. And for more on the geopolitical implications of this weekend's actions, we're going to bring in Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director at the McCain Institute. She's also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine under the Obama administration. Evelyn, it is good to see you. We are talking about what is going to happen next with Nicolas Maduro, but there has also been a huge emphasis, of course, on what is going to happen next in Venezuela as President Trump asserts that the U.S. is going to run the country. In practice, what is this actually going to look like?
Yeah, Tyler, in practice, it sounds like President Trump is going to try to run Venezuela through the illegitimate vice president who worked under Maduro and the rest of the Venezuelan apparatus that was there before Maduro and his wife were removed. So it's not really a change in the government or the type of regime. But the idea is, I guess, that the United States will be telling the Venezuelan government what to do. Now, whether that government listens or not is a whole separate question.
Well, I guess that still doesn't exactly answer who is running Venezuela, Evelyn. President Trump said twice on Saturday and doubled down on Air Force One last night that it was the United States. When we saw the Secretary of State make the rounds on Sunday morning television, he did not support that claim. Is it going to take some time to figure this out?
Right, Joe. Well, obviously, it's taking them some time. That's not ideal, because what you want to do is put in another government, a government that has clean hands, that doesn't have individuals who, frankly, are guilty of all of the things that Nicolas Maduro did and will continue with that conduct in all likelihood, unless the United States either puts troops on the ground or finds a way to convince the Venezuelan military and security forces that their bread is buttered by the United States, not by the current and the former regime. You know, what we would want is to put in the legitimately elected government, even as an interim measure, you know, some sort of, or a coalition somehow. You know, we do know that Edmundo Gonzalez was resoundingly voted into office, although Maduro ignored that vote, you know, over a year ago. So the Venezuelans could also hold new elections. Like I said, you can have an interim government. But what we're doing right now is really just decapitating the government, and it's unclear whether the United States can run it through this new person, this vice president.
Well, Evelyn, as Joe mentioned, we heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He conducted a series of interviews over the weekend, and he laid out some of the immediate priorities for the U.S. We could talk about oil, but also, really importantly, he said that they have a demand for Venezuela to cut ties with some of the U.S.'s adversaries, like Cuba, but also Iran. I'm wondering if you could just give us the geopolitical worldview here. How feasible is that for Venezuela moving forward to shun those ties with these other countries?
Well, you know, if you hear frustration in my voice, Tyler, it's because we have contradictory messages and objectives, and this really has been the case from the beginning. And what the Secretary of State is laying out is actually an argument for change of the government, regime change in Venezuela that is, broadly speaking, popular not only in Venezuela but in the United States. That is to say, to actually follow the will of the Venezuelan people and to make sure that they can have a democratically elected government, not this, you know, corrupt, drug smuggling regime that's been in power for the last at least 10, probably 20 years now, if you count Chavez in there as well. So the reality is that we want them out, and yes, part of it is because if we have a democratically elected government in there, we can rightfully assume that they will not be friendly towards the communist dictatorial government in Cuba, and they will be friendly towards the United States, and then we can help them with the oil production and putting money into their infrastructure. But if the United States puts money into an oil infrastructure in a corrupt country that's still ruled by the Maduro gang, if you will, I'm not sure whether that's a good deal for any U.S. companies, much less the U.S. government.
Interesting. You know, the administration has gone out of its way, Evelyn, to say that the U.S. is not at war with Venezuela itself or the people of Venezuela. Listen to the way that Mike Waltz, our UN ambassador, put this earlier today before the Security Council. Listen.
Nicolas Maduro is responsible for attacks on the people of the United States, for destabilizing the Western Hemisphere, and illegitimately repressing the people of Venezuela. As Secretary Rubio has said, there is no war against Venezuela or its people. We are not occupying a country. This was a law enforcement operation.
But unlike most law enforcement operations, this one toppled a leader. Evelyn, how is this not a regime change operation if the U.S. ends up running Venezuela?
Well, so this is, again, why I think the American people are confused. And part of it has to do with legal arguments, Joe. What Ambassador Waltz was putting out there is a legal argument that basically under U.S. law, we can go and seize Maduro, which I think I'm not a lawyer, but technically speaking, I think that's true. So in order to make sure that we have a firm case against him here in the United States, we don't want to call it something, a war act. The other reason is, again, I think he's right. We're not at war with Venezuela. We're not at war with the Venezuelan people. But the best way to show that, frankly, is to support the opposition, to make sure that that the opposition, some coalition, ideally it would be Edmundo Gonzalez, who's in exile in Spain, and the Nobel Prize winner, Maria Corina Machado, that together they go in and they can rule in interim. We can help Venezuela hold elections again. But in order to do that, our government needs to lean heavily on the security forces in Venezuela, because the security forces have to become aligned with the opposition. And in order for that to happen, the United States needs to put the big thumb on the scale.
Evelyn, in the final minute that we have you, I want to pull on your expertise when it comes to Russia. This is actually something that we discussed in the early edition of Balance of Power today. I'm curious how you think the Kremlin is watching all of this unfold, since we know that Russia just signed a strategic cooperation pact with Venezuela in the last few months.
Right. I mean, look, President Putin, he hates regime change. He hated it when we bombed Libya, and essentially it led to Muammar Gaddafi not only being removed from power, but being executed in a really grisly fashion on the streets of I believe it was, well, I'm not actually sure what city he was in, but in any event, President Putin has spoken very loudly about that. Apparently, he watched that video over and over again. So he was opposed to us when we, of course, went into Iraq in 2003 with regime change as one of the potential rationales for it. So he will be upset by this. But at the same time, we know that President Trump has bent over backwards to try to have a good relationship with Putin, so he personally won't feel impacted, and it may be he may start using similar excuses to the ones, or excuses, rationales, to try to get away with similar behavior. So that's the worrying part.
Evelyn, great to have you back, as always. Evelyn Farkas, helping us start the new year here on Balance of Power from the McCain Institute. We thank you, as always. Meantime, the big U.S. integrated oil companies saw their stocks rally after President Trump promised to revive the Venezuelan energy sector. Take a listen to his plans for the oil majors following the ouster of Maduro.
We're going to have the big oil companies go in, and they're going to fix the infrastructure. They're going to invest money. We're not going to invest anything.
Fixing the oil infrastructure, though, no small job. We're talking about what could be $100 billion over 10 years. And Energy Secretary Chris Wright plans to meet this week with oil industry executives to talk about this very opportunity for investment in Venezuela. Today, some stocks did move. Chevron, the only major U.S. oil company already in Venezuela, ran up some 5%. Exxon and ConocoPhillips were also higher today, up more than 2% each. To help us break it all down, we turn to power moves now with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who's live in New York. Romaine?
Yeah, Joe, and I'm actually glad you used the word integrated oil companies, because that is the key here. Some of the pure play oil and gas producers actually fell today. It's those companies that have the ability to actually build out infrastructure that saw some of the strongest bids. Remember, oil prices themselves only were up about 1.5%. If you take a look at Brent crude, that's the global benchmark, it's still about 25% below where it was about a year ago. So why did we see stocks rally? Well, it was names like Halliburton, which, of course, has a very big business in helping to build out energy infrastructure. It had one of its best days in a long time. So did Weatherford. So did SLB. And then you had refiners like Valero and Chevron in that as well. But when you look at names like Diamondback and a few others, they saw almost no action at all, Joe, largely because of the concern that once you build up the energy infrastructure in Venezuela, in theory, that means oil prices will actually start to go down. In fact, that's one of the big reasons why you actually saw airline stocks rally by the most, at least on an intraday basis, since 2020. The idea that potentially over the long term, we could see jet fuel prices drop down. And you saw Delta Airlines hitting an intraday high on the day, JetBlue and a few others also moving higher as well. So this is not going to be a rising tides lifts all boats when it comes to the oil and gas sector, primarily just those who are going to directly benefit, or directly be involved, I should say, in the actual build out of the infrastructure, Joe.
And Romaine, what about the view on defense stocks? I mean, we had the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick yesterday on Air Force One telling reporters that the administration hasn't just been in touch with oil companies, but also the private sector when it comes to the critical mineral supply chain, which is critical for those defense companies moving forward.
Absolutely. And when we talk about the geopolitical implications of what the Trump administration did over the weekend, it raised a lot of concerns as to, well, did they just stop at Venezuela? Did they go into Ecuador? Did they go into Colombia? Trump, of course, today addressing the issue of Greenland, saying that maybe in 20 days he'll revisit that. And then, of course, there's the issues of whether countries like China look at what we did in Venezuela and say, well, maybe now is the moment to take advantage of this when it comes to Taiwan and a few other things. One of the main benchmarks that tracks global defense stocks that actually had its biggest rally going back to 2023. And it wasn't just U.S. companies like Lockheed and Northrop. It was names like Rheinmetall that actually rallied, a big European defense contractor, BAE Systems that also rallied by the most in several years. So you have a lot of investors right now positioning not so much around what happened on Saturday, but more importantly, trying to position around the idea of what could potentially come next, Tyler and Joe, over the next few weeks and months.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick reporting live for us at World Headquarters tonight. Thank you, as always. And coming up, Congress is set to be briefed by the Trump administration on the latest in Venezuela. We'll discuss with Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York. That's up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
That the future of the Venezuelan people should be determined by the Venezuelan people, not by Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, or Stephen Miller. Are you kidding me? These people don't even know how to run the United States of America. The American people reject the possibility of another unjustified foreign war.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Tyler Kendall. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, where we heard earlier today from Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries blasting the Trump administration just moments ago for its actions over the weekend in Venezuela. Lawmakers on both sides have been split in their reactions along party lines. Now the Trump administration is set to brief top members of Congress on their decision to act in Venezuela just moments from now. 5:30 is the bicameral briefing. Joining us now with his reaction to everything we've been talking about here, Republican Congressman Mike Lawler of New York, who's a member of both the House Foreign Affairs Committee, you should know, as well as the House Financial Services Committee. And Congressman, it's great to have you back. I'm just curious your thoughts on complaints about lack of notification in this case. The 1973 War Powers Resolution requires the president shall in every possible instance consult with Congress before introducing armed forces into hostilities. Should the president have given you a heads up on this?
I mean, well, first, let me say, listening to Hakeem Jeffries, I think if President Trump endorsed him for speaker, he would resign. I mean, no matter what the president does, my Democratic colleagues are in opposition. And the reality here is that during the Biden administration, they called repeatedly for Nicolas Maduro to be removed as president because he was illegitimately elected. They called for him to be arrested. President Biden put a $25 million bounty on his head. If they weren't serious about that, then why did they do it? When it comes to notification to Congress, the fact is that the law requires within 48 hours, and Congress was notified. They are being briefed tonight, as you alluded to. We will have further briefings hopefully this week for the entire Congress. But the fact is that there have been numerous instances, including in the lead up to the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound, where the briefing occurred after the operation was complete. This is about operational security. You had a law enforcement operation that, frankly, multiple news outlets were made aware of and thankfully did not report on it until after the fact. They did the right thing. But unfortunately, when you have something as sensitive as this, where you're going into Venezuela for the purpose of arresting the, quote unquote president, the illegitimate president, Nicolas Maduro, obviously it's a hypersensitive situation. And frankly, given the response by some of my Democratic colleagues, I don't blame the administration for not advising them in advance of the operation.
What if there's another strike, Congressman, that's not as targeted as what this mission was to take out Nicolas Maduro and bring him to the United States? Because the Trump administration hasn't taken off the table that we could see further action in Venezuela, depending, for example, on how Delcy Rodriguez works with the U.S. moving forward.
Well, I'll refer back to 2011. And the decision by President Obama to engage in an 8-month campaign in Libya. And people like Chuck Schumer were fully in support and, in fact, voted against a war powers resolution that would have ended, our engagement there and, in fact, embraced the removal of Gaddafi. So, I think the hypocrisy here by some of my Democratic colleagues is rather rich. The fact is the president is legally justified to engage in military strikes. We have not declared war. This was a 3-hour operation, a law enforcement operation with the support of the Department of War to ensure the safety and well-being of those law enforcement officers that went on the ground to arrest Maduro and read him his Miranda rights and bring him back to the United States to stand trial. He was indicted 3 times in the U.S. For his illegal and illicit activities around the drug trade. But moreover, obviously, you see ships being seized and sanctioned in and around the Caribbean because of his illicit oil trade with Iran. And the sale of oil to China. And so the fact is we have sanctions in place. These are sanctioned ships. We are going after them. And this administration is actually following through on what Democrats said for years that they wanted done with respect to Nicolas Maduro and Venezuela.
What'd you make of the president's remarks on Air Force One last evening coming back to Washington, Congressman? He floated Colombia, which he's been talking about a lot, as a potential next target, and even Greenland, he said, might for our national security interests be worth pursuing. Is Venezuela an isolated event or the beginning of something bigger? He's calling it the Dunroe Doctrine.
Look, for decades, Republican and Democrat administrations have failed to focus on the Western Hemisphere. And in many respects, especially in Central and South America, we have allowed it to devolve, where you have these socialist regimes. It has created the migrant crisis that we have dealt with over these past few years, and a huge surge at our border. Obviously, President Trump has secured the border and effectively ended, illegal immigration into the country. He rightfully declared these cartels, narco-terrorist, cartels, and designated them as foreign terrorist organizations. He is going after them with the boat strikes that we saw, and you've seen rather quickly the intended effect there. A lot of these boats have stopped. And by arresting Maduro, he's making it clear that you cannot flout the law. You cannot, stick your thumb in the eye of the U.S.
I've only got 30 seconds, Congressman. I'm sorry, and I don't want to cut you off. Is Colombia next, then?
Look, I think the Colombian president should recognize that what they have been doing is not going to be tolerated, and they should seek to work with the U.S. To address these issues from the drug trade beyond.
Congressman Mike Lawler of New York, we thank you for being with us on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Cuba looks like it's ready to fall. I don't know if they're going to hold out. But Cuba now has no income. They got all of their income from Venezuela, from the Venezuelan oil. They're not getting any of it. And Cuba literally is ready to fall. And you have a lot of great Cuban Americans that are going to be very happy about this.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Tyler Kendall. And that was President Trump over the weekend, floating the idea that Cuba might be the next regime to tumble, claiming without Nicolas Maduro, the nation is left without its principal global ally and energy supplier. Joining us now with the latest on how other countries in the region are watching President Trump's threats is Bloomberg's Jimena Zuniga, who joins us live from Buenos Aires. Jimena, how are you assessing this likelihood that we could potentially see a domino effect? And I also wanted to ask specifically about President Trump's message there, that without Venezuela, he doesn't think that Cuba can survive. In his words, the country is, quote, ready to fall. How likely is that?
Well, I think that he points out to is the fact that Cuba is an island country with a failed economy that depends critically on Venezuela's support, and particular cheap oil or heavily subsidized oil to function minimally. And so the blockade on Venezuela's oil is going to be a serious hit to the Cuban economy. But I think that this dovetails with your question on what might happen next or who may come next, in the sense that Trump's comments suggest that the U.S. is in no rush to do anything actively against Cuba other than what they have done on Venezuela, because the regime may implode on its own. And so we think that the probability that Cuba suffers a military action as Venezuela did is a small risk for now.
So should President Petro go into hiding in Colombia while he's got the chance?
I think good question. I think that if we had to make a ladder of the countries that are mostly at risk, I think that Venezuela was very much an outlier case, in the sense that its risk reward was humongous in comparison with that of other countries. It's rich in resources. It had a dictatorial regime in place, no military capacity to respond significantly, and a big part of the world, while critical of the U.S. Unilateral use of force and some of Trump's remarks afterwards, is happy to have seen Maduro go. We saw celebrations across the globe by Venezuelans, diaspora. But so I think that Venezuela was an outlier in that case. I think Cuba does not have the same economic opportunity for the U.S. and does not pose a significant threat either. And in the case of Colombia and Mexico, it's both democratic governments. Colombia has had a spat with the U.S. Since Trump took office, but at the same time, it's facing elections this year. It has a long-standing, strong relationship with the U.S. I think that the U.S. best bet is probably just to wait out until elections have a solid chance of bringing in a political change there toward the right, and also toward the pro-U.S. government that the U.S. can coordinate and cooperate strongly with. And Mexico, I think, is even a lower risk of suffering an attack. One thing is Venezuela, a dictatorship; another, a strong democracy with 100 million people and 3,000 kilometers of border with the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Jimena, thank you. Bloomberg's Jimena Zuniga reporting live from Buenos Aires. Joining us now with her reaction to all the events that have unfolded here in Venezuela, Democratic Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander of New Hampshire, who is a member of both the House Armed Services Committee and the House Committee on Small Business. She also served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Navy Reserves for more than a decade. Congresswoman, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm just struck by the conversation that we're having here about what some see as a new world order. And we just talked to Congressman Mike Lawler, the Republican from New York, about whether Colombia is next. The conventional wisdom, as put forth by the president himself on Air Force One last evening, is there could be any number of nations who would be, quote unquote, next on the list, Greenland included. How do you describe this moment that we're in?
Well, thank you so much for having me. You know, this is a perilous moment. It's a moment in which the President of the United States has put the American people in a very difficult position. My constituents here in New Hampshire, we're feeling a lot of pain right now because we're in the midst of a genuine, full-blown affordability crisis. People have lost their health care. They're struggling. They're having to make the most painful choices that a person could have to make, choosing between paying their rent and keeping the heat on. It's this president has shifted focus in a way that is dizzying, and and very concerning, I think, to every American.
But, Congresswoman, what do you make of the administration's argument that this is going to be good for the world order? In their words, when we're talking about taking down a narco-terrorist who's now serving trial in New York, have you heard from your constituents that they've been in favor of something that we've heard both sides of the aisle applaud, at least maybe not how the administration went about it, but the end goal of what was achieved?
Look, I think the president and the administration have a lot of questions to answer about what the goals really are here and what comes next. And that is the question that's top of mind for me. When the president was asked this question on Saturday, what comes next, he said that the United States would be running Venezuela. Look, Nicolas Maduro was a dictator. He is a thug. He was a total disservice to the people of Venezuela. I have no higher priority than keeping the people of New Hampshire safe. And that means cracking down on transnational cartels that are fueling overdose deaths here in my state and across the country. But this administration, at so many critical junctures, has shown a fundamental unseriousness about actually tackling criminal cartels and the drivers of American overdose deaths. Just a few weeks ago, President Trump pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was directly responsible for sending hundreds of tons of drugs into this country. Why did he do that? Well, Roger Stone asked him to. And this is what we're seeing from this president and this administration. I served for years at the Justice Department. We have some of the most extraordinary investigators and prosecutors who have been doing fantastic work for our country. And what we've seen under this administration is a real attack on some of the lifelines and the most fundamental and important work that we do in cracking down on transnational cartels. So it's very hard for me to take seriously this one of the several justifications that this administration has put forward for what they're doing in the Western Hemisphere and what they're doing in Venezuela.
Mm-hmm. Well, Congresswoman, you turned to domestic politics pretty quickly when I first asked you about what had happened in Venezuela. And so I want to get to that a little bit more, because lawmakers like yourself are all coming back into town now with a deadline that you're facing at the end of the month. We already went over the so-called Obamacare cliff, but there's a funding deadline at the end of January that might be worth our attention here. There have been several attempts at passing War Powers Acts. It looks like the Senate will force another this week, and most expect it will fail. But there's also concern about the argument over Venezuela becoming a real problem in negotiations over defense appropriations, and that, in fact, could help us slide into another shutdown. Is that on your radar?
You know, I've been on the job now for 1 year and 2 days, and from the moment that I was sworn in, from before even starting, I've been focused on how we actually get into a place where we've got the right rules of the road and a plan in place to make sure that we don't see a government shutdown. We should never have had the longest government shutdown in American history. We had a Speaker of the House who has continually obstructed productive negotiations that can and should be occurring to prevent a future government shutdown. We've got common sense bipartisan legislation to prevent that from happening. But at bottom, what we really need are people of good faith who are sitting on our Appropriations Committee and who are going to do the basic job of making sure that we are funding this government. On the Armed Services Committee, one of the things we've heard from literally every person who's come before our committee is that one of the most dangerous things that we can do for our national security is to continue to operate on continuing resolutions, which undermine the very fundamentals of our national defense. So this is a huge priority for me this month before the January 30th deadline. This week, though, we do have finally the opportunity to force a vote in the House of Representatives to extend the ACA tax credits, which are a lifeline for millions of Americans and which are a genuine lifeline for critical access hospitals here in my district. The Speaker, as he has been in actually the fundamentals of budgeting, he's been a complete impediment to common sense solutions to preventing massive spikes in healthcare costs for millions of Americans. And it's just absolutely unacceptable.
Congresswoman, has a date been set yet for that vote? And is there any momentum that you've heard that this is actually something that could make its way through both chambers? Because we did hear from the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, earlier today, who said he doesn't think that the government's going to shut down over health care.
Well, look, with respect to the tax credits and the common sense solution that we've got, the bipartisan solution to extend the ACA tax credits, we had 218 members of the House of Representatives before the end of the year last year, and the Speaker refused to allow this bill to come for a vote. We are gonna continue to press the case this week. We've had to use every procedural avenue, including a discharge petition, which has really been the way that we've been able to make law on a bipartisan basis in the House, and that has been a workaround that we've had to adapt to, and that's what we'll continue to do, to find and create the common ground and the pathways to actually get things done. That's what brought me to this job, that's what brings me to this work, and that is my singular focus.
All right, Democratic Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander of New Hampshire, thanks so much for joining us on Bloomberg Television and Radio. And CES, the annual consumer tech event, is back this week. Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang's keynote address is underway right now. He's announcing a new lineup of AI tools for self-driving cars and humanoid robots. For the details, let's turn now to Bloomberg's Annabelle Droulers, who's live on the ground at CES in Las Vegas. Hey, Annabelle.
Yeah, we've got Jensen Huang, as you said, just kicking off CES for 2026. This is actually my first time here. I'm usually based in Asia, and I really just can't overstate the significance of this event and the size of it, which I really haven't been able to appreciate before. But as you can see there, Jensen Huang is on the stage, and he's talking about the Vera Rubin platform or Vera Rubin architecture. So this is essentially the successor to the Blackwell series. It's a lot more powerful. It has a lot more compute power as well. And he's saying that this has gone now into full production, which means that we could ramp up into the year end. So that's significant, of course, because we're actually hearing him talk about this architecture a lot more early in the year than he would typically, which I think also speaks to the concerns we had going into the end of last year, very much around those AI bubble fears, which he hasn't addressed specifically, but he did talk about really that computing revolution we're seeing that's being driven by a couple of different factors, and he's saying that that is what's actually driving R&D spending on this. So again, pointing to that demand, it is real, it is genuine, and Nvidia is still positioned very much at the center of this industry.
Well, Annabelle, you wonder if this drives a whole new embrace of the AI spend, much like his last keynote did here in Washington, D.C. But sometimes you need to show up with the deliverables, and it looks like autonomous vehicles might be one of those today. What's he telling us in more detail?
Yeah, that's right. I think that focus very much on embodied AI or physical AI has been a really big factor on feature of his presentation so far. So autonomous driving, he's talking about this so-called Alpamayo model. So autonomous driving, of course, we're hearing a lot more about it, but what he's saying is that so far the technologies haven't been able to solve for what's called the tail risk, which is when you're driving out in the real world, it's full of messy, very unpredictable situations. He's saying that Alpamayo is going to have that ability essentially to stop, think before proceeding, and that is what's going to take it to a much more human-like capability and be very much important going into autonomous driving technologies moving forward.
Remarkable. Nvidia shares slightly lower in after-hours trading. Bloomberg's Annabelle Droulers, we thank you so much, live from the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Coming up on Balance of Power, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz announcing that he will not seek re-election amid a fraud scandal in his state. We'll bring you the details. Plus, we'll discuss Maduro's arraignment and the broader geopolitical impact with our political panel. It's all ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio alongside Tyler Kendall. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We'll turn back to the ousting of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro in a moment with our political panel. But first, the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. The Department of Health and Human Services moving to change recommendations for the U.S. childhood vaccine schedule, including no longer broadly recommending the influenza, rotavirus, and COVID-19 vaccines. Change comes amid a sharp increase in flu cases that has already killed 9 children across the country this winter. While insurers will still cover these vaccines without cost sharing, the change in status could could present hurdles for parents who will now be required to consult a doctor about immunizing healthy children against these viruses.
And Minnesota Governor Tim Walz announced he is no longer seeking re-election for a third term amid widespread allegations of fraud centered around the misuse of COVID-era relief funds in child care centers, with dozens already indicted in 2022 as part of a $250 million scheme with the nonprofit Feeding Our Future. Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar took to social media after the announcement to call Walz a, quote, true public servant, and according to sources, is seriously considering a run for the governor's seat.
Joining us now with their reaction to this and more, this evening's political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis, our Republican strategist and partner at Stone Court Capital, alongside Democratic analyst Jeanne, Zaino, Democracy Visiting Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. It's great to see you both coming off quite a weekend of news here. And where to begin, Rick Davis? There are a lot of questions about what the grounds for justification are for this administration, but you're hearing Democrats in many cases have to check themselves and say that Maduro was a dictator. We just heard the Congresswoman say this, and an awful guy, and he had to go. But it's the way the administration went about this that is the problem. Do voters think this way?
No. In fact, there's a little bit of data that indicates that voters are kind of split right now on how the administration went about dislodging this couple from power in Venezuela. And so, look, at the end of the day, I think it's people inside the Beltway who have this debate. When you get to normie voters, I don't think they're talking about this at all.
Really?
They're talking about their health care. They've got the rates going up. They're talking about the economy. I mean, like, what's interesting is the Democrats have totally taken the bait on this and aren't talking about the core things that'll help them get elected in the midterms. They've been sucked into this internal, inside the Beltway debate that is actually helping Donald Trump.
Well, Jeanne, to Rick's point, is this something that could help Republicans coalesce around an issue going into the midterms? Because we really spent the last few weeks centered on divisions within the Republican Party when we were talking about them trying to find a way forward when it came to going over the Obamacare health care cliff.
It depends on how Democrats handle it. And I am, always reluctant to say they're going to handle it great. But they can do two things at the same time. They can make the case that the president who promised to focus on America, to Rick's point, to address incredibly high health care costs, grocery bills, an economy, AI taking our jobs, and all the other things on his plate, he has instead decided he is going to break and buy Venezuela, and all of his senior staff are going to run it. That's not something that even his core supporters banked on. So Democrats can make this message, but Tyler, whether they will make it or not is another question. And of course, it also depends on what happens going forward. Donald Trump is talking about this oil boom in Venezuela. What oil companies are going to seriously invest in a country run by people who supported strongly Hugo Chavez? They were running from there. They're not going to go back with this kind of uncertainty. So the boom he's talking about is probably going to wait or take a few years if it comes at all. So a lot Democrats can chew on if they choose to do it. And that's a big question.
Rick Davis, I want to ask you about congressional notification, war powers and authorization, and the debate that we've been hearing about this as well. This seems to be falling along party lines at the moment. As someone who spent a good chunk of their career in the Senate, though, right about now, they are behind closed doors, getting a classified briefing from everyone involved here, Department of Defense, the CIA, the FBI, and so forth. Should there have been a heads up? The president says Congress leaks, but surely he's not referring to the Gang of Eight, which takes pride in not leaking. We just saw a news release come out. Chuck Grassley's name is on it, along with Dick Durbin, condemning the administration for not inviting the Judiciary Committee to be part of this briefing. What do you make of this?
Look, I think a lot of this is just politics. We know from reports that the administration was looking at doing this incursion into Venezuela for 4 days, and weather held them up. Could you imagine how much at risk it was to be allowing this to get into the public domain during those 4 days where everybody was in place, ready to go as soon as the skies cleared? And so I'm sure there was a high level of paranoia. And we know from the reports on how this operation took place that the element of surprise was critical to being able to keep down and ensure that our side of the equation didn't get any casualties, and that we were able to get in and get out with the prize, which was the president and the first lady. So I think it's a hollow argument. We are not at war with Venezuela today. I appreciate the fact that the War Powers Act is an important element of congressional authority, and I'm for congressional authority, but I just don't think this is the way that this debate should be proceeding at this point.
Is this debate going to continue, though, if the administration does strike again? Are we going to see any sort of difference in how the White House informs Congress or doesn't inform Congress? Because President Trump hasn't taken it off the table that a second wave, as he likes to call it, of strikes could be coming depending on how Delcy Rodriguez ultimately responds.
Every president that I'm aware of has had this debate in Congress, right? This is not the first time a president has acted unilaterally without the approval of Congress to go in and create a military action. So we're always going to have this debate. And this is a good debate to have. This is a healthy debate, right? Where does the congressional authority start and stop? Where does the presidential authority start and stop? That's healthy to our democracy to have that discussion. But it shouldn't hold up the fact that we had an amazing outcome, great tribute to the U.S. military and strategic planning on the part of the White House.
Well, big questions about whether this complicates our funding deadline at the end of the month. We just asked two members of Congress about it, Jeanne, and I'm curious your thoughts. Could the anger and distrust here, the argument over Venezuela, maybe we add Colombia between now and then, be enough to dislodge a defense appropriations bill and therefore help the government shut down again?
Oh, I don't see the government shutting down again. I would hope it didn't. It doesn't. But absolutely, anything goes. And this Congress has not proven itself to be able to stand up to Donald Trump in any capacity. And, I think it is important to note that while they didn't trust Congress and they decided not to inform Congress in advance as the Constitution and law requires, they did inform members of the press. So apparently they decided that they were going to inform some members of the press about this and not members of Congress. That is not the choice of the White House or the administration. They have to follow the law and the Constitution. It is Congress's right to decide this. And they denied them that right, but it's not going to matter in the end unless Congress stands up and says enough is enough about this aggrandizement of executive power. And so far, the 119th Congress has shown no willingness to do that. And I don't think that's going to change in the next few weeks. And that is going to be unfortunate for our democracy as a whole. This is the first branch of government. The president has to go to Congress for authorization.
Rick, 30 seconds. What's your prediction here when it comes to this government funding deadline?
Look, I think the Appropriations Committee are working hard against a very bad deadline. It wouldn't surprise me that they try to extend it a little bit to give the committees a chance to rationalize. The House is not on the same side as the Senate, but they've got the same overall number. So this fit should happen. It's just how much time is left to do it.
All right, our political panel tonight, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Thank you both. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
There's a lot in that newsletter. I'll tell you what, it's been a couple of weeks, if not even more for you. It's back to reality here. Thanks to Rick and Jeanne and to you for being part of our conversation. We'll meet you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.